The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Franklin in continuation.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. What we had last week in relation to biosecurity is an Audit Office, Australian National Audit Office report on biosecurity in Australia, and the findings of this report are incredibly concerning, Deputy Speaker. The ANO report concludes that the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment's arrangements to respond to non-compliance with biosecurity are, and I quote, largely inappropriate. What does this say about the Morrison Government's interest around biosecurity risks? The ANO's findings in relation to the inadequacies of Australia's biosecurity system need to be taken seriously. A biosecurity system that is deemed to be inappropriately managed has massive implications for the agriculture sector, and it puts Australian farmers in a very vulnerable position, which is totally unacceptable. The ANO report also validates numerous and serious concerns raised by farmers and producers and the agriculture sector. As already mentioned, biosecurity threats and inadequacies of the current system are issues that are consistently raised with me, and no doubt from MPs across all parties are being given this concern by their local constituencies. Incursions of pests and disease are of great concern to farmers and producers who know the significant risks if and when Australia's biosecurity system fails us. When the Morrison Government really must do better when it comes to the agriculture sector and Australia's biosecurity system. Of course, Deputy Speaker, we know there are other issues impacting the agriculture sector that the Morrison Government has also done nothing to fix, even though it knows it's impacting on Australian farmers. We've seen today an announcement about agriculture workers and overnight, and we know that there has been a labour force issue on farms across this country for years. Years and years. But this pandemic hasn't been going just a few months, of course. The government promised last year 25,000 vetted workers from Pacific nations. Now, by the government and the minister's own admission, less than 7,000 of those workers have made it into Australia and onto farms. I mean, we keep hearing the government talking about how they help farmers all the time, but when it comes to the reality, what we actually get is something very different. The farmers know the government is not delivering when it comes to the assistance they continue to talk about and continue to talk about all the time. We know that they're not actually delivering on all of their announcements when it comes to assistance for farmers and regional communities. They talk a lot and they say a lot, they announce a lot, but they don't do very much, Deputy Speaker, and this seems to be a consistent theme from this government. When we talk about the budget and we talk about the workforce and we talk about the ANO's biosecurity system and how inappropriate it is, the government says, oh, but, we put $370 million in the budget. If that money hadn't gone into the budget, as I said earlier, then they would have actually gone backwards in biosecurity expenditure in this country, backwards. And that $370 million is mostly capital expenditure required to fix the ICT system, which we know isn't inappropriate, and the government's talking about relying more on artificial intelligence. And I have raised my concerns about that in this chamber before. We all know how the government goes when it comes to ICT systems. They aren't very good at it, Deputy Speaker, to date. So I hope that these investments in the ICT, in our biosecurity system that farmers and producers are relying on, actually works. It needs to work, and the government needs to make sure that it does work before it introduces this system. It absolutely needs to make sure that this happens. In the meantime, as I said, we've still got farmers and producers who can't get their fruit and their produce off their farm because the government hasn't done enough about labour. As I said, the ag visa that was announced overnight and being talked about today, 3 years ago it was promised. 3 years ago. And now the minister's saying, oh, we might get it done by Christmas. What is the point of having all of these workers ready when we don't have a national quarantine system, when we're not all vaccinated, when we can't open our borders? I mean, how is that going to help farmers who need workers now? When the government was asked this question, they don't have an answer. They just try and blame the states for not doing enough quarantining. Well, quarantine is their job. Quarantine is the federal government's responsibility. It's not the state's responsibility, and they've been on alert about this for months and months, and they know they need to build a national quarantine system, and yet we haven't seen it. We still haven't seen it. So what we've got from this government is more ad hoc pieces of legislation, more trying to look like they're doing something when they're actually not really doing very much at all when it comes to Australian farmers, when it comes to biosecurity and the risks that these pose to our agriculture sector. When you've got farmers talking about tens of millions of dollars in loss for not being able to get products off farm, and you've got the government re-announcing something they announced 3 years ago and saying we're really going to do it this time, farmers are a bit sceptical, to be blunt about it. If you actually look at what the NFF said, it was interesting to see the Minister for Trade read some quotes from the NFF here today. He didn't talk about what they said about their ag visa, where he said the farmers actually need to see this delivered because they're a bit sceptical, basically. And who could blame them? Who could possibly blame them after what we've seen from this government?
Rare. The NFF
Seriously, like all the time, talking, announcing, and not really delivering. And then, of course, we've got the one thing they don't want to talk about, as we saw from question time today and the motion that I moved earlier, the mouse plague. Here we have a very serious mouse plague. Some are talking about it being the worst Australia's seen. We've got the New South Wales Farmers Federation saying, this is going to cost around $1 billion to production of New South Wales farms. $1 billion. You've got the 4 states, you've got Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia where this mouse plague is now, and you've got the federal government saying, not our job, it's up to the states, don't look here. And then we had some bizarre response from the acting Prime Minister today, which basically said, why don't we catch them all and then re-release them in the inner city so they can bite people and scratch them? It was the most bizarre thing I think I've heard in here in a while. The point is he should be serious, Minister, at the table. The point is that Australian farmers have been dealing with this mouse plague for months. Your government has done nothing about it. There's no national response plan to deal with the mouse plague, and the farmers are crying out for this federal government to do something about it instead of sitting on your hands saying, not our problem. That's what's happening on that side of the House. Deputy Speaker, Australian farmers need to have confidence and certainty. They need to know when the government says something, they're going to actually deliver on it, and we don't have that today. So when we have this legislation talking about the importance of our biosecurity system, I hope that the government is really seriously taking this with the utmost seriousness, as it should. We need to make sure that the biosecurity system delivers for our vital agricultural and our producers in Australia. We need to make sure that all of Australia can have confidence in our biosecurity system. We need to make sure that whether it's human biosecurity, plant biosecurity or animal biosecurity, this government is doing its job, and we want to move a second reading amendment that reflects our ongoing concern about the government's inaction. I therefore move that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting the following words. Whilst not declining to give the bill a second reading, the House notes that the Coalition Government's ongoing delays to upgrade Australia's biosecurity arrangements. We have an A&O report that says they're not doing enough, and they're not doing enough at all, and they need to do so much better. Deputy Speaker.
Is the amendment